Hey everybody, it's just me, Steve. Today is March the 10th, 2022. Sitting in my backyard here in Mexico, drinking beer and thinking and talking about politics. If you see me swatting, it's because it's that time of year here where the bugs start getting pretty nasty. So I had a question kind of cross my mind today, and I wanted to talk to you about it. And I think I have an answer for it, but we'll see what you guys think. And that question is really, why is India, Brazil, South Africa, and Pakistan, among several other countries, refusing to still condemn Russia and what's going on in Ukraine today? These countries have faced intense pressure from the European Union, from the United States, and from international organizations like the United Nations and International Monetary Funds to condemn Russia. But they've done the opposite. They've even pushed back publicly when they were called to do so. Pakistani Prime Minister called out President Biden and said, "We are not your slave." The foreign policy advisor for Brazil came out and said, "We are at peace. We're not pointing fingers or laying blame on anyone." India was quite vehement in rejecting its condemnation in Russia, to go as far as to walk out of a quad country meeting that they were having on the issue with representatives from the United States, Germany, and the European Union. India, Brazil, South Africa are all members of BRICS. I like to think everyone knows what that means already. You should know what that means, but BRICS is the economic and trade union that comprises Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So, what do they know that the major transatlantic powers either don't want us to know, refuse to acknowledge, or aren't telling us? I think to get there, we kind of have to go back through history. And we're going to have a little look here at how we got to kind of where we are today and what could be influencing this. Pretty much 100 years to the day, in 1922, the Rapallo Treaty was signed in Italy. This was a treaty that was signed between Russia and Germany after World War I. It was designed to repair the damage that was done between the countries as a result of the war and establish new trading arrangements. But the primary purpose, at least from Russia's perspective, was to prevent financial collapse in Germany. Russia knew that its success and the success of Europe would rely on a strong, solvent, economically safe rebuild of Germany. They knew anything else would be disastrous and counterproductive. This treaty allowed for the cancellation of all German debt owed to Russia and all Russian debt owed to Germany. And this is going to be an important legal basis for what's to come, I think. But put a little footnote on that, and we'll remember that for my next video because we're going to go into that a little bit more. Other countries, however, did not follow suit. Despite Russia's insistence, they forced their claims for war losses and debts on Germany. Shortly thereafter, of course, we know what happened. The German economy collapsed. They entered a period of hyperinflation, which ultimately led the seed for what would come, World War II. But knowing this, why would Europe demand Germany repay an unpayable debt? Everybody knew that Germany would never be able to pay this amount. It was something ridiculous, like 300 years of their total GDP. It was astronomical, just insane. As a matter of fact, it wasn't Europe at all. It was America and Britain that demanded it. America's position was simple. If Europe wanted help, if Europe wanted the help of the USA to rebuild, the countries of Europe could not forgive any German debt and had to hold Germany responsible for all war damages. You see, the US saw an opportunity here. US banks could continue to lend Germany enough money to enable it to meet its reparation payments. See what's happening there? These countries, in turn, could use their reparation payments from Germany to service their war debts to the United States. That's right. America financed the war for most of Europe. The only way America could be guaranteed that they would get paid back was if they dropped all of this bad debt on Germany. So you see, America knew, and so did Europe at that time, that Germany was going to go down economically, financially. You can read about this. It was called the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan. These were the two major pieces of policy that were developed post World War One. And these economic plans actually became the basis for what's now modern day foreign economic policy in America. And ironically, you can actually see these exact same scenarios still playing out well after World War One. Conflicts like Korea, Vietnam, Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, just to name a few. Remember the rebuilding of Iraq? It's going on right now. It wasn't free. It's backed by American financial institutions. It's created debt that Iraq will have to repay for many, many, many years. How good of a racket is that? You go in, you destroy a country, and then you give them the bill for it, and then you rebuild them, and then you give them the bill for that too. And then you force them to pay you back over a ridiculous period of time. This is the equivalent if I was a contractor of me going up to your house, burning it down, and then offering to rebuild that house for you after charging you for me burning it down at the same time. It doesn't make any sense. The Young Plan, and this is actually really interesting. If you're going to read any of these references, you should read the Young Plan. It also called for an establishment of a bank for international settlements. This was designed to facilitate the payment of reparations. It formed the basis for what would eventually become the modern day SWIFT. Is anything here starting to sound familiar? So, why are these BRICS countries not conforming to the consensus from London, Wall Street, Washington, Brussels, everyone else, every outraged person on the street, on Facebook, every social media channel and media outlet that's out there? Well, I believe this rift is the beginning of a division. It's a separation from the leading developing countries, leading developing economies, sorry, from the transatlantic economy. They're dividing from what is that historical circle between the European Union and America and Canada and Mexico, and they're going their own way. Transatlantic economies, so that is again Europe, mostly Europe, America, Canada. We've been successful because we maintain economic prowess through a series of speculative bubbles. These bubbles are propagated by our central banks. Every time our financial system starts to quiver a little bit, we pump a bunch more money in to prop it up. Everyone gets interested because there's money, of course, flying everywhere. And I know this is overly simplifying it, but it really is a simple way of explaining it. And we come out of our recession stronger and we build back better than we ever were before. So you might have heard that term before, build back better. You're going to be hearing it a lot more soon. Anyways, this economic subjugation by Western-centric unipolar, and what the term unipolar means, it means basically everything in the northern hemisphere. It's the idea that our economies, everything in the northern hemisphere is superior, everything in the southern hemisphere is really just not important. We dominate in the north. Anyways, um, this economic subjugation by Western-centric unipolar countries have been the basis of economic growth in the developed world since World War I. We know this. This is true in general context, but there has been many other factors leading to Western economic superiority. Um, Ideological differences between modern unipolar economies and the BRICS economies are that they're largely committed to economic development through a physical economy. So this is trading in tangible assets, and we're talking about things like oil, gold, nickel, steel, wheat, all of those bases, the raw resources that the world needs to continue. They reject outright, wholeheartedly, monetary policies that artificially propel their economy. And this is really where the two spheres kind of diverge. Now, what's been happening since BRICS was really formed is kind of an economic Cold War. And you'll see, actually, if you look in the New York Times today, there was an article and it was referring to the beginning of World War III. But World War III, as they're quoting in this scenario, is not being fought by nuclear weapons. It's not being fought by conventional weapons. It's an economic war. It's interesting. So, practical applications in geopolitics. What's going on? So through war, it's possible that you can isolate BRICS economies and economic machines and repolarize the world. This is something that BRICS countries have been well aware of and they've been preparing for quite some time. And we can track this quite easily. In fact, all the BRICS countries have been buying gold and increasing physical gold reserves for close to 20 years now. In contrast, unipolar countries have been steadily selling gold into the world market, liquidating reserves, seemingly in an attempt to undermine the value of gold. They're trying to prevent the value of gold from getting to a point where it's economically viable for someone to come out and replace the US dollar as the petrodollar, as the leading trade dollar in the world, with a gold-backed currency, because you'd have an advantage with a gold-backed currency. A gold-backed currency is not going to be subject to or not as sensitive to things like inflation. It's going to be guaranteed in a tangible asset. BRICS countries led central banks, adding over 650 tons, a record number, to their reserves in 2019. That was a record number in the previous 50 years. That number was only superseded in 2018 by 656 tons. Leading the recent buying spree of gold, China, Russia, Turkey, Kazakhstan, India, Uzbekistan. Interesting. What else have BRICS countries been stockpiling? US dollars. And a whole lot of them. And that might sound counterproductive, and it almost is. Except in a war, you need weapons. And US treasuries, when you hold enough of them, are a nuclear weapon. BRICS countries control 40% of all US treasuries outside the United States. 40%. These holdings are the equivalent of a nuclear weapon. If even one country from BRICS decided to move away from a US dollar-backed system of international trade and move to a gold-backed currency, it would absolutely decimate the dollar. If you thought things were bad in the Great Depression, uh, you haven't seen anything yet. This might explain why every country has tried to move away from US dollar has met fierce opposition. And if we look at this list, there's some notables in here. And before we get into the notables, no, I'm not a nut job. No, I do not believe that some of these people are good people. No, I do not believe in a lot of this ideology. I do believe most of these people were terribly bad human beings, and that's why it was so much easier to paint them with a bad brush and do what we did. So here's the list. Let's have a look. Iraq. Saddam Hussein announced that he was going to release a gold-backed dinar. It was going to be funded by selling oil for gold. It was going to replace the US dollar for all Iraqi transactions for its gold reserves. 3 months before that gold dinar was going to be formally released, the US invaded under the pretense that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. We know that George Bush did not find weapons of mass destruction, yet Saddam Hussein was still killed. And lo and behold, we all know what's going on with the rebuild in Iraq. Venezuela. Hugo Chavez nationalized oil projects and started selling oil for gold. He was about to do the exact same thing, switch to a gold-backed reserve system funded by oil. We all know what's happened to Hugo Chavez, and we all know what happened to Venezuela. More recently, Libya. Muammar Gaddafi was about to introduce an Africa-wide gold-based dinar funded by Libyan oil. African oil, Libyan oil, African resources. This was going to be an Africa-wide currency, gold-backed, that was going to enable the people in Africa to share in the continent's wealth. Of course, this would never be accepted. New Year's Eve 2016, 3,000 emails from Hillary Clinton were released by the U.S. State Department on a judge's order. One of those emails contained correspondence, well, not just one, many, but one in particular had correspondence between a NATO attaché and Hillary Clinton. That April 2011 email, and I quote, said, "This gold was accumulated prior to the current rebellion and was intended to be used to establish a pan-African currency based on the Libyan gold dinar. This plan was designed to provide the Franco-African countries with an alternative to the French franc and US dollar as a means of international trade." None of it goes on and on and on. You can read it. The link is down again in the references. You can go through all the emails there if you want to, actually. They're all public and they're all unclassified. They weren't leaked illegally or anything like that. What is interesting, though, is that none of those emails that were released at any one time did Secretary of State Hillary Clinton or any of the other NATO delegates did they discuss the pretense for war, which was publicly, of course, the human rights atrocities which were apparently occurring? So where are we today? Russia is the number one exporter of oil and natural gas. In 2014, when sanctions began as a result of the annexation of Crimea, Russia began to move away from the US dollar as its means of payment for its natural resources. In fact, in 2020, almost one third of its exports were paid for in euros and gold. Something that the US protested, of course, on many occasions and even tried to influence the buyers from these nations um, to stop the practice. Recently, the Washington Post published an article how Putin tried and failed to protect the ruble from sanctions. The premise, of course, is that the devaluation of the ruble has crippled Russia's economy, both domestically and internationally. Well, this would be true in part. It is true in part. The ruble at the time that I'm creating this recording is trading at nearly 140 to 1 US dollar. That's almost double the exchange rate prior to the conflict in Ukraine. This would lead one to believe that the sanctions are working. However, they're not. And I'll tell you why they're not. Well before the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the subsequent sanctions that Russia faced, they started moving away from importing goods and materials from countries that the US had a sphere of influence over, where they could impose sanctions and hurt Russia. In fact, the period between 2010 and 2022, right now, has been an industrial revolution in Russia. Russia has rebuilt factories, is taking its primary and secondary resources and actually making materials out of them now. They're refining their own steel. They're doing everything again that most countries and even Russia for a period of time has started doing offshore, where wages were cheaper, where the cost of production was cheaper because you didn't have environmental regulation and all of these sorts of things. Basically, China. But anyways, we'll get into China in a little bit. So we had an expression in the military. Most of you know I'm retired military. And that expression was lead your target. What that basically means is you need to shoot at where something is going to be, not where something was. Interesting if you think about it from the idea of sanctions. Now, while I might sound like I'm anti-American or anti-European Union or Canadian, I'm certainly not. I am Canadian and I am a product of Canada. I am a lemming. I love our way of life. I very much enjoy our quality of life and the creature comforts that we're able to have. I don't for a second believe that the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Canada, the Chancellor of the European Union, I don't believe that any of these people are stupid. In fact, they're surrounded by absolutely brilliant people. So you have to ask the question. They knew that Russia has rebuilt its manufacturing sector. They knew that most of the goods that were being prohibited, the trade that's being sanctioned, isn't really going to have an internal impact on them. So why? I don't know. Now, I can tell you this from firsthand accounts, and I can tell you from accounts online. Again, many of you who know me know my wife is Russian as well, and I try not to let that bias impact me whatsoever. But it does give me an insight as to what's going on. As a result, the cost of domestically produced goods has not gone up in line with the disproportionate deflation of the ruble. The same computer that cost you 50,000 rubles before the current crisis still costs you 50,000 rubles to buy today. Same for bread, milk, chicken. In fact, the price of gas and fuel has even gone down in Russia. You see, what's actually happened is that while America and the EU were asleep at the wheel, Russia's diversification and strengthening of its relationships within its BRICS partners has made it sanction proof. I mean, you can't buy an iPhone anymore. We all know that. You're not going to go to McDonald's in Moscow anymore. You can't really buy a Gucci bag in Moscow, or maybe you can, but you're definitely going to pay more for that because these sorts of creature comforts aren't available anymore. but that doesn't prevent average everyday Russians from living. And an interesting thing here, going into this war, again, Russia was stockpiling US dollars. Now, we know some of these assets were frozen offshore, but by all accounts, they still have access to over $450 billion in US treasuries and US funds inside of Russia. Russia has built an internal sphere of trade and economics. So, what really we've done by increasing the cost of the US dollar relative to the ruble, almost doubling it, is that we've doubled Russia's ability to pay salaries for its public service. Russia cashes in dollars, trades for rubles, and lo and behold, they're getting double their money overnight. Um, Russia is paying for imports from India, from Pakistan, from China in rubles. These sanctions and policies that are bringing down the world economy seem almost deliberate. There's no rational explanation once you look at what's actually happening and the real impacts on the ground in Russia versus the real impacts on the ground in the rest of the world for what's going on. At least, certainly not in the context of defending Ukraine. There's estimates right now that the lack of fertilizers that are produced using Russian natural gas and potash could reduce global crop yields by 50%, leading to an international food shortage. The ban on Russian oil and gas have increased oil prices by almost 40%. The price of oil bounced off $130 per barrel twice, and natural gas is trading at over 375 euros per megawatt hour right now. Coal crossed $435 per ton from just up over $70 per ton a few months ago. Major metals of industrial use like copper, nickel, and steel are up from 50 to 100%. In fact, nickel the other day crossed an almost 200% line. So, and interestingly, and this might be one of the biggest issues that we're going to have, credit default swaps. Remember those little bad boys from the 2008 housing crisis? Credit default swaps on Russian bonds are exploding in value. However, the companies issuing them are going bankrupt. These are American and European companies. They have nothing to do with Russia. The trade of a credit default swap on a Russian equity or a Russian bond doesn't impact the government of Russia whatsoever. These insurance instruments, the value of the contracts are so high now that the companies who underwrote them, these insurance company, are illiquid. If everyone tried to cash in these credit default swaps right now, there is no way in hell they would ever be able to pay the companies that are cashing them in. Interbank lending is ceasing as it did in 2008. The market is becoming illiquid. But you can't pump more money into the market right now as they did through quantitative easing in 2008. It won't work today. You saw the US inflation numbers come out this morning. US inflation is at 7.9%. And that's not even increasing. Those numbers are up until December 31st. It's not even including the increase in costs that we're seeing in the last couple of months. So, most of you aren't going to like what I'm about to say right now, but it has to be said. I'm not heartless, but these are just simple facts. And I'm going to try to stick to facts, not speculation, not conjecture, nothing else. There's over 40 wars going on in the world right now, all over the world. Far more people are being killed than in Ukraine, and by far worse methods. Horrific atrocities are occurring in Nigeria, Congo, Sudan, and hell, in Syria alone, estimates of the dead now are ranging between 600,000 to 1 million people. Why is Ukraine worth it? And by it, I mean, why are the countries that govern the current world economic order seemingly willing to go all in on a Ukrainian intervention? I propose that this is not a war in support of Ukraine, but an economic war against Russia and against BRICS. Any countries that don't accept the new Green Deal or the Great Reset as pushed by the Davos crowd are being isolated economically. You remember earlier when we discussed the DAWs and the Young's plan and the Young plans, and how that enabled the U.S. to launch themselves ahead as an economic superpower? Well, the Eurasian Integration Project. Do some reading on that. I would Google that if I were you. It's built around the Belt and Road Initiative that China's had ongoing for almost 15 years ago. When you look at that and you look at what those initiatives did post World War One, they're strikingly similar. If you ask me, these BRICS member nations are getting ready to poise to leap ahead to try to take advantage of this situation and undermine the US dollar. I think we're on the cusp of something critical here. I think and I pray that we don't see the use of this nuclear economic weapon, the undermining of the US dollar, and the implementation of a gold standard currency. Because if we do, I don't think there'll be any coming back for North American and European economies. Anyways, these are just my thoughts. Don't mean to get too serious, just having a couple of beers and thinking in the backyard. Leave your comments below. If you disagree with anything, please keep it civil. I'm always open to discussion and I'm always open to your ideas. If I got something wrong or referenced something wrong, please let me know. Again, I appreciate the constructive criticism. Have a great day and see you in a few days for the next video. Have a beer.